So one of the ways that we talk about using our software is to think about it like you have with a data warehouse, for instance, but you can use more types of data, more data of that data, and do that at a more efficient cost basis. So one of the things that we look at and talk to our clients and prospects about, both in the public sector and commercial, is the impact of what big data means to their organization, how that actually fundamentally changes their processes and their thinking about it, because technologies like Patrick Hadoop open up the door to different kinds of analysis that you didn't have before, because either constraints within your current technology base or constraints because of budgetary reasons and the like. And so it has a very fundamental effect to how an organization brings to bear their faculties against data and what they can do with it. So while we're a technology company, this isn't necessarily a technology discussion, right? Technology is an enabler to that. And so that's something that I think runs throughout this particular talk, but also what we see as a company as Cloudera. Let me turn it over to Rita.
Good morning, everyone. As I was introduced, I am the CIO for the County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania. I've been in Pennsylvania for, 30-some years, and spent time as a consultant with our local children and youth agencies, fiscal and computer development, and came to work at the County Commissioners Association about 17 years ago. I started out as the IT director and am now the CIO. And we represent and work with the county CIOs across the state of Pennsylvania, including the county and city of Philadelphia and Allegheny. Our focus is basically around how can we help both the state and the counties identify areas to deliver technology and the associated services in a more effective, more efficient way. Our current project or program that we've started in the past few years has been the development of a unified case management system for adult probation, jail, and district attorneys. We're a private cloud. We are a quasi-governmental entity, and as such have created a private environment that the counties can share. They can have their data hosted with us, but they're the owners of the data. So in that, we'll talk more about how did we get there and what have been the pitfalls, what have been the lessons learned, and then what have been the rewards. One of the things that Carolyn and I were just talking about, we're curious to know a little bit, if we get an opportunity when we're done with our introductions, what drew you to this session? One or two comments, give us a little feedback before we get started of what is it you're hoping to gain from our discussion and the things that we'll share.
I'm Carolyn Sanders, 9 months into my stint as CIO of National Endowment. What's interesting is I've had IT positions at large agencies, agriculture, small agencies, EPA, Small Business Administration. But what's really key is it's always about the data, the information. It's not the wires, hardware, software. They want to know about the data and the information. And it's something I'm extremely passionate about, as you'll probably see from my questions and responses. So I'm looking forward to speaking about my passion and hearing what you think.
Now, you bring up a very good point about interactivity, that I don't want to have the questions at the end if we could. And so either raise your hand, or maybe we can have a couple segments along the way where we can actually solicit them. But let's start off. I mean, are there certain questions or topics that drove you to this panel today, or what you'd like to hear from today from us? And more coffee?
I was going to say that's breakfast.
Sure.
So I came because I'm interested in the issues that non-profit organizations are facing, and whether they're different or the same from federal agencies, and what service providers can do to help those.
Great. Any other?
I'll work that into some of my answers.
Well, let's kick off with what I was talking about earlier, the culture change that data brings to your organizations. How has the kind of rise of big data, the importance of data in your organization's thinking, how has it changed the approach that you and your business, your organization actually functions? How have you seen that impact in that, or has that been an impact?
I think the impact has been Google is your friend. There's so much data out there, it may not be the right data, it may not be in the right format, but there's an increased emphasis on delivering solutions quick, fast, and in a hurry. And the immediate fact-checking. You get asked a question from your stakeholders, how can we start this project? And your first answer is, can you give us a minute to think about it? Well, your stakeholders want it right now. They've already, in the midst of responding to their question, they're on their computers. So the culture has changed where IT has had to step back and start to be more transparent. There's not a black curtain with the secrets in the background with mainframes where nobody knows how data is processed. It's more open, more revealing, and it's forced us to be more of a partner. Lots of communication, lots of collaboration. I think in my speech yesterday I mentioned relationships and trust and knowledge, sharing that information. I think that has become key to success, where your soft skills are almost as important as your technical skills. And that's a big culture shift in organizations. Chief information officers with a big I, not a little o. I think that's the key.
The other thing that I've seen in recent years, past several especially, is the change in the staffing and the individuals that we interact with. We're starting to see the millennial generation come into the workforce and very much changing their view of data is changing and affecting how we view data. Mobility is huge. They don't, back to the accuracy of the data, they don't always take a look and say, is this the accurate or best source to get the data from? I just need to get it quickly. And there's this balance between those who are not the millennial generation and those who are, in terms of not wanting to squelch the ideas and what the younger generation is bringing to the table, but also a little bit of realism to help them understand you can look at data, but do you understand it? Are our universities and our colleges teaching the importance of analysis? And over the years, as I've had interns and younger folks on my team, I ask the question, what is this data saying, or what do you think you're going to find? The anecdotal is important for the validation process. It doesn't mean that your hypothesis is going to be correct starting out of the gate, but at least do that exercise. So from a cultural perspective, I think we need to embrace that generation, because most of us in here will probably be retired in the next 10 years, and that next generation is going to take the helm. So are we going to be able to prepare them for the aspects that we think are critical?
So what you talked about being able to foster and cultivate, the millennial generation, and also the skill sets involved in making sure that it's a capital I, a little o. What are some of the ways that you have looked at developing that training, either informally or formally within your organizations? How do you foster that kind of soft skill and mindset?
I think the approach that we've taken, and what I see that is working well, is the mentor approach. And recognizing that those who, in my case, might be 30 years younger than I am, really have good ideas. But let me share with you, okay, here's the political environment that you're walking into. And here's what you need to be aware of when we go into that meeting. Idea's a great one, but let's think about how we're presenting it. I'll share with you, before we started our program, I talked to you mentioned about the unified case management. A young gentleman, 22, just finishing his education, and he came out of the meeting, he was like, I don't get it. What is so hard about unified? And I said, well, you didn't grow up with those silos. And we have to overcome that gradually. And right now, you don't have buy-in from the state stakeholders or the county stakeholders who hold the money and who are the decision makers. So we have to present to them in a structural way and an analytical way, here's why we want to do this. So mentoring, spending time outside of the meetings, outside of the planning sessions, helping the younger generation see that it's different in the real world. Still that same approach, I think.
I try something different. It's called effective listening. I go to meetings and I network for information, not my next job, my next project. I want to make sure that IT is viewed as a trusted advisor. So they invite us into their meetings early, often, so we can assist. Yes, we're going to fail sometimes, but we'll fail faster and recover quicker if we're in the meetings and they trust us to share. They have these ideas. I say in this world of technology, sometimes I wish we could go back to the post office where you mail a letter and there's some time to think about it before they get it. But effective listening means thinking about what they said and what you said back. So effective listening and networking for information.
You mentioned the kind of transparency and the very the fail fast, and one of the things that when we talk about this impact of information into the business process, there's a certain sense of tolerance to risk that I think is different than what we might have had before, at least from a developmental point of view. You're very much a kind of waterfall type methodology. You're going to know what you're going to ask, and you're going to know, the very fine degree of that. And what we're seeing is that given some of the flexibility that the underpinning technologies provide, but also the very approach to information has kind of changed that dynamic. Can you talk a little bit about how your organizations are helping to either mitigate or embrace this kind of inherent unknown that I think the information brings to the table?
Okay. You mentioned about a waterfall approach. How many of you, first of all, know what that is? Okay. How many of you have used waterfall forever and a day? Okay. We, in our organization, because we weren't into software development per se until about 7 or 8 years ago, I knew what the waterfall approach was, didn't really do a lot with it. We started with our unified case management, and with the underlying foundation that we're using is a Microsoft product. And I started reading about this agile approach. I'm like, what is this? Okay, this makes sense. And then one of my staff went to a Scrum training, and I'm like, Scrum? You want to define that for me? And she came back and said, let's implement Agile and Scrum. Okay, what is that going to do to our day? So we started out really gung-ho, and not that we're not gung-ho now, but really started out with that daily meeting, and what did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? What are your impediments? And iteration development. We've modified it, and if you want to have that breakout, we can do that later on, but you really have to make it your own. Don't take for gospel everything you read about the Agile approach or the Scrum methodology, but make it your own. And we realized by going in this direction, we were going to give our stakeholders what they've been asking for, and that is, as you develop the software, we want to see it, even if it has bugs in it. So we said, are you sure? Because that's the risk you're taking. We're going to roll this out to you sooner than later, but you're going to see it as we go along. And what happened with our very, very first rollout, we were being pushed, and we were trying to balance expectations with reliability, and so we rolled it out to the first county. They fully understood there will be some bugs that need fixed. That's a big difference from the waterfall approach. And I think that our culture and individuals have a little bit more tolerance for that because of the results that they're getting, the data that they're getting access to. We are taking counties in Pennsylvania from a Windows-based application, in some cases a DOS-based application, into this web-based environment where all they have to do is click a button, and now they've got a really nice dashboard or a view of data that they never could have in 15 minutes or less ever before. So it's awesome what we're delivering, but the risk is higher because there will be errors. When you go through that agile, that iterative approach, there has to be a tolerance for that. And where the success comes is how quickly you are in responding. If you say, okay, that's a bug, we have to fix that in the next 24 to 48 hours, boom, it's done. You'll notice with our cloud products, you'll log in one day and with any cloud product, and it'll have one view. The next day it might be different because the very large vendors are taking that same approach. Quick delivery of changes and improvements. So with that comes some of that risk, but the tolerance is good so long as you're responsive throughout the entire process.
I think the way that I've embraced risk is making it a team concept. Everybody's involved. Everybody has a solution. We need a whole partnership. And when we identify as a team, everybody helps, innovative ideas, solutions come up, and we all share success and the risk of failure. We're more likely to embrace it, and sometimes you don't know what you don't know, but you also don't know what you do know. So I build on that effective listening, communication, and shared collaboration. It seems to work. It works in sports, so why not have it work in the government?
So let's, any questions at this point? Yep, question in the back?
So I hear words like responsiveness and scale come out in your comments. Could you put that in numbers, roughly speaking, what does that mean to you? Scale and responsiveness.
I didn't understand.
Could you rephrase the question?
How big is your data, and how quickly do you need to process?
How big is the data and how quickly does it take for us to process it? That varies. With our bringing together 3 different departments, adult probation and jail and district attorney, that's almost a different answer within those departments. So big data for adult probation may look very different than our district attorney's office. District attorney departments are very concerned, rightfully so, about the charges. Why is an individual being charged? Is it the right charge? And is the documentation there in the database now in some fashion to justify and validate what that offender is being charged on? So that's one set of data, although it's being shared. On the adult probation side, they've already been charged, they've been sentenced. Now the data that I need access to is more from that monitoring perspective. Here are the special conditions for that offender that they have to meet, and here are the case notes. So if that offender reoffends, he's back on the DA side, there may be sharing of some of that, the case notes from the adult probation side. How do you do that? That's where the dashboards that we've created and how making that data available based on proper security roles helps the system work more effectively, but it also helps move the offender through the process. One of the things I always share with everyone is we look at the criminal justice system as an important evil, or some cases the offender considers it evil, of our judicial system. And what we sometimes forget is that offenders take on many different shapes. Many, they may be from middle class, they may be from upper class, they may be from whatever class you want to call, but they still are individuals and they still deserve that due process. So taking the data and making sure that that happens is extremely important. And I forget the second part of your question, sorry.
Responsiveness.
The responsiveness is critical because, for example, on the DA side, they only have so many days to prosecute a case. If they don't bring that individual to trial, that case is thrown out. So the responsiveness is critical from a time perspective, but then back to the official or the effective processing of the offender for their rights and what they deserve through this process.
I think my answer is varied. It depends. As you start to become a trusted advisor, your users expect more. They want to answer fast. How many users learn to expect this? Well, it depends. If they want to know how to do outreach, what's the impact? We give grants. What's the impact to benefit? Is there some state that we didn't provide information or access to? In the past, it would have been, oh, let's do a survey, take about 30 days. No, you start to explain to them, do a little analysis, use business analytics. They have a response in less than a day. They start to expect that. The next time they want the response as soon as they ask the question. You don't get 5 minutes to type it in. They're like, Carolyn, you can't give it to us in one click? So responsiveness and the scale, it depends on how you've lobbied and how successful you've been in becoming a trusted advisor.
And I would add to that an example, if I could. In our program that we've started with the counties, within 3 months, one county came to us and said, I want to share with you what happened with our president judge. In the past, he has asked questions and has wanted information based on offenders and why they are incarcerated or why are they on probation now, and is it drug related, because we are moving towards more drug courts in Pennsylvania. So in the past, she could not get that information quickly. And he asked her a question that day about the mental health conditions. She went to her records person and said, can you pull this up in UCM? That's what we call it. Within 15 minutes, she had a complete listing of active offenders and that category that the president judge was asking about. And she was able to walk into his chambers, share that information, and instead of waiting the 2 weeks to the 3 weeks to the 4 weeks, making a decision about whether they move forward with a particular program, he had that information in front of him that day. And they do expect it then.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a danger.
One of the themes that kind of came out in those last two answers was kind of shifting from sort of a reactive mode to a little bit more of a proactive mode. And one of the themes that we're seeing, again, in industry and in public sector is a role that's sort of shifting and emerging within the various organizations that kind of surround both technology and the business use of data. And some folks have called this the data wrangler. I've heard also the data engineer, but it's a person who is, for lack of a better term, the champion of a data set or the use of data. And so they're not necessarily the owner of the data, but they are the main facilitator. And I think in an old world, they were, okay, I'm your ETL jockey. I'm going to be the one who's actually going to take the requirements and process them and make sure I can hand them back. And this new role has sort of shifted to say, this is how you as the business user should think about this data. Is this something that you've seen within your organization? Is it a conglomeration of folks within your organization that are starting to do this? What's facilitating that moving from a reactive phase into a more proactive phase?
I think for us, it's this whole open data initiative where we're looking at a chief data officer, chief digital officer, a lot of chiefs. But someone has to be the one to interpret and work with the business. What do you need? How do you need it in order to do your job? And with the data breaches that are coming quick, fast, and in a hurry, there's even more of an emphasis on a data wrangler knowing where are your high-value targets and how do you protect them, how do you use them. In the past, you just ask for something. I need a report of everybody. Well, what do you really need? What are you trying to do? That data person translates. I think I walk around most of the time just calling myself C. It could be Chief or Carolyn. It depends on the day. They're always wanting something, but someone has to be the one to interpret and translate. Some of the larger departments have already embraced the idea of data and how do you manage it. I think transportation and commerce are out in front and center on it, but some of the other organizations have to consider the same thing. It's all about the data.
So I would add to that, what we're seeing in Pennsylvania is the use of what I call a business analyst. It's been around a long time. When you filtered these questions to us, I thought, well, is our business analyst becoming our data wrangler or data engineer? And I believe that if you start anywhere, start with the business analyst, because that very much is the first stepping stone to getting there. In implementation of change, and I want to really stress this, the business analyst is absolutely needed. And it's the one who takes the approach of, okay, what's your process? What's the data you've been collecting? And here's my favorite question, why? Well, because we've always done it that way. No, let's go back to square one. Why do you do this today? And I will be honest with you, we have counties that are very willing and ready to evaluate that and make changes, because technology is a tool. It is not the reason you make changes. It gives you the ability to make improvements to your process. So they'll walk through that, and then we'll get to the, well, I need these reports. Okay, is it a report? Is it a dashboard? Is it a view of data? You're getting them to think beyond asking for a report. That's all that individuals and the users were able to get in the past. Now you have different ways of seeing the data. So do we want to make a change to business process? If you have a department that's ready to do that, that embraces that change, then your implementation of using a new technology is going to go that much better, and you're going to get to the end result of quicker access to data and the ability to analyze that data in a responsive environment. If you have leadership or even that, what I call that higher tier of staff who are resistant to change, I've done it this way, I'm not changing, and that's just the way it's going to be, then there's going to be a lot more failures than there's going to be success.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, absolutely.
So that is an issue, and a lot of times when there's a limited budget, it's hard to convey the value of doing the business process work up front. And so do you have any good ideas about convincing them you're not just going for a technology solution, and you really need to look at what you're doing first?
Yeah, I do. In our work that we've done and are doing with the counties in Pennsylvania, early on it was, well, do we really want to buy into this program? So we had a pilot group, and they watched the process. Next thing I knew from our success, we had them lined up out the door. And it was that we need it fast, we need it quickly. And we have this gate approach. So I have 8 gates that I developed that we work through with what we call the department or the data owners. And what we showed them was, here's the analysis of the workflow of the business and how you do it. Here's what we found in the other 23 counties. Work through that, and because we have an example where I'm going to call it a failure, a stop. They'll revisit this next year. We can say, here's what happened when the process wasn't followed. And it actually resulted in the expenditure of a whole lot more budgeted money than if we had taken our time and done the business analysis. And I don't want to shortchange the data cleanup. Just had a CIO last week who I know they've been pushing to go live with our program this year. And he said, yeah, adult probation wants to go live. We had a discussion about their data, and it's going to take them 4 months to get everything cleaned up. They recognized that because we had IT at the table from the county, we had the business owner at the table, and we gave them a set of questions to ask. And by doing that, they recognized, my gosh, if we don't do this piece up front, then the implementation is either going to be less than successful, or there's going to be a lot more pain. So part of it comes from example, and the other part comes from having a good sound approach to walk the individuals or the groups of individuals through. Does that make sense?
So would you please talk about cases, about specific cases, when you analyze data from different sources and found correlation between them? You just talk about dirty data. I understand what you're talking about. So I'd like to hear about projects that you're particularly proud about and how you overcome the issue when data from different sources and you try to correlate them. I would like to hear specifically.
Okay. So the County Commissioners Association received a grant back in 2008 from the Department of Justice to do what was called data quality and to implement the NEAM approach. How many of you are familiar with NEAM, National Information Exchange Model? So we worked with our steering committee and identified 77 data elements that we wanted to go into the county departments, at that point run the crystal report, because that's what we had access to, and compare the data in each of those areas against the NEAM standard. It was ugly. I mean, we knew that. So we had agreements, we had MOUs with the counties to allow us to run SQL scripts to update the data so that it was NEAM compliant. We had to be very careful from the criminal justice perspective that we weren't altering criminal history data, things like that. But we took time to bring the data consistent with NEAM. We didn't say, okay, adult probation, you have this data, jail, you have this data, and DA, you have this data, and it disagrees between the three. We said, you know, if we make this NEAM standard, by default, these three are going to be consistent. A great example of this is the fact that software did not have what was called a judge code table. So when we would try to do dashboards, we would find Blekovich as the judge name spelled 13 or 14 different ways. You cannot do any type of analysis on that easily. And so we realized the state had a different source of the data. It wasn't the name spelling, it was a code assigned to each of those. So we were able to write scripts that brought the county data in compliance with, here, not necessarily a NEAM standard, but a state standard of the judge code, and standardized across the state in those departments that we ran this on, the whole judge table. Now in our program, we get that feed automatically from the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts, so that going forward, there's not any issues with it. So that was the approach we took. We really strived to use NEAM wherever we could, instead of trying to take 2 or 3 different data sources of the same data and make them standard. Does that make sense?
What about, I mean, on the topic of the programs, the roles, and data governance, I mean, you talked about NEAM. How have, again, how has that changed over time? And what's the impact of the requests that your constituents or your users have? How has that impacted the way maybe your governance programs are being executed? I mean, I think a classic example we hear about, for instance, the financial services world, is that they might have had a policy for certain retention of data, and they recognize that through the correlation that they were able to use and the analysis, that they actually were able to go forward and make a business case that in this particular set of data, we'd like to actually propose a change to our retention policy on this, so that we can have some policies around it and extend out the life of this, because we see more value in that data. Can you talk a little bit about if and how you've seen your organization change its policies around use of data because of this new generation and the use and the kind of iterative development, if you will?
I don't think I've seen a effort to reduce the amount of data or the retention of it. I think that with the growth of technology, I've seen hoarding of data, because I now have this vast repository. Storage is cheap. I can analyze and get more trends and analysis of the data. So instead of them reducing the amount of data that they hold, they hoard it. They think storage is like pennies on a dollar now, so let's keep it.
And I would agree with that. The ongoing discussion in Pennsylvania, and many of you may have this at the federal level, is how much is too much data, and is the need for a retention schedule there or not? Email is a great example, if I digress a little bit here, but we have counties that keep every email possible because of the e-discovery and open records policies that we have in Pennsylvania, to some of the very public situations where they're keeping the data for 10 days. So it's a struggle, and even when we ask for guidance from the state perspective, it's not so much the mode of what the data is in or how it's being delivered, but what is the data. So if the data is criminal justice related and the offender has gone through the process of expungement, what does that mean? And so we've had approaches where we have to expunge it, we have to take it completely out of the system. Well, there goes your analytics. How do you take 20 cases that were expunged and keep that piece of information to see if you're being successful from a different perspective. So what we just, this past weekend, there's a couple legislators meeting right now, and there's a bill before them that will alter a little bit expungement of data because of technology. What I've been saying for probably 2 years now is with proper security roles, you can keep certain pieces of information and still be able to do your jobs and still be able to follow expungement. Our legislature's been a little bit slow in understanding that, and we're finally getting to a point where they are coming up with the technology. So like I said, I agree that we definitely are keeping a lot more data than we used to, but I just read this morning, all right, I was looking at my phone when I was driving, sorry, and I saw this, that I didn't text, I didn't type, but I saw this note about how much is too much, and I'm like, what the heck is that? So when I got here, I opened it up, and it said that 69% of the data that we're keeping has no value. And wow, did that make me stop and think, what's that going to do? What does that do to the data that we do have and our approach to it? So I have somewhat of an answer, but now I'm back to square one on that one.
So it has no value. How do they make that assessment? I mean, I guess that's another line of question that I had here was, what are the inputs? What are the criteria that you go through the assessment? Because one of the things that we see, for instance, in the technology stack that makes up Hadoop, and there's a degree of flexibility that I don't think is afforded by a lot of traditional systems. So one of the ways that we approach it is that you can look at the potential of data and say it might not have immediate value right now. That doesn't mean that I'm asking the questions that need to be asked right now either. And so there's this balance that has to be played, and this technology stack, for instance, allows to have that kind of conversation. But what were the criteria that do you guys look at, and how does that evolve over time? How do you actually strike that balance between something that Carolyn, you had talked about with the kind of traditional role of the CIO, wanting to limit data, and the new role of the CDO of being on the opposite side of that, and that kind of ties up with everything you're saying while you're driving today.
I know, I'm in trouble now. As I was analyzing that in my mind, walking in the door here, I started thinking about the new technologies that we have available to us. Instant messaging. If you talk to a millennial, email is a thing of the past. I still can't grasp that just yet, but instant messaging, and if many of you probably have young adults that fall in this category, how are they communicating? Where are they putting the data? They're not necessarily putting it into a database. That's in that instant messaging. So it's not an easy thing to analyze that data. That's where the tools come into play. But what is in that instant message? I think about my office and where are we going for lunch? Are you in your office? And I mean, that's the type of data that's in instant messaging. We're able to move it from email into instant messaging. Does it have value or not? Today it doesn't. 3 months from now it might. So that I didn't necessarily agree with everything in the article, but it's if you were a wizard and the Wizard of Oz and think about being there and being all knowing, if I knew what I needed to know 3 months from now, I could help control that better. And we don't, so we go with what we have.
See, I tend to view it a little differently. The person that has to do the work knows what they need. So how is it valued? It depends. If you have to make a decision on something, what information do you need and what format in order to make the right decision? So I'd have that question of how do you use the data?
Do you see that having that impact on the rise of that sort of data wrangler and the data
It does,
engineer?
because you got to have some tough conversations, listen, and communicate. Once I give you a balance, it costs this much money to have this huge hoard of data, but also it has this much risk. So having that instructive conversation, you can make some decisions. It's a balance. It is. I tend not to want to control when it comes to the business. I want to be a trusted advisor. I want to give input, give advice, expert opinion, and then we make a collaborative decision. I don't want to delete all their data just because it was easy for me. And that instant message, 3 weeks from now, it might have been, we need to make a key decision. Where's everybody at 12 o'clock? So it depends on who has to make the decision and what information they need.
And where it is. I want to
Yes.
throw out there, we are, I use the word struggling, but really trying to grapple with the use of cloud storage that is personally acceptable, or accessible rather. And instead of your assets being stored in your network, they may now be stored out in the cloud in Dropbox or some of the other cloud storage similar to that. And do you have the access to it? Absolutely agree from the perspective of not wanting to control or tell folks what they should and shouldn't do, but also advising from the risk perspective, if you're going to use and allow these tools to be used and the data is going to be stored elsewhere, here are some suggestions and recommendations on the parameters.
Let's talk a little bit about the technology that underpins this. Do you think it is at both the rate of change, but also the tools that are now available, the tools you see on the horizon? Is that is that accelerating your use in your analytics? Is it impeding your use in the analytics? Where do we sit on that barometer?
It's tough to keep up, and the tools are awesome. I use GIS as an area, a really good example with this. Years ago, and not too long ago, 10 years ago, the GIS expertise that you needed to have in-house was much more technical. With the rise of Google Earth and some of the other tools that are being maintained by vendors in an open environment, that technical expertise isn't near as important as it is understanding and validating the data. So, I think you're going to see a change on the skill set side for needing those business analysts or the data wrangler more than you have in the past. But B, you really have to take a step back, and you don't have to implement every new tool or the newest version. Microsoft is our big player in this arena, and they're rolling out new versions faster than they ever used to. And they're great, but now you have to go back and you have to retrain your users. So there needs to be a balance in terms of implementing the new versions as well as new technologies. And some of them don't have the staying power. So I like to be cutting edge. I don't like to be bleeding edge.
I think that because our users have been groomed to expect instant service, instant everything, that it's forcing us to address business analytics at a quicker pace. Because your boss now doesn't have to ask you a question and it takes you 3 weeks to think about what he asked you. He's already on his computer and he's doing data visualization. And you're like, wait, I'm trying to get the criteria for you. No, I want it now. So I think that technology is rising at such a rapid pace that the expectations of our users are also increasing at a rapid pace. It's up to us to add a little speed bump every now and then, data quality, security, privacy, but it's traveling at the speed of light. That's what I see.
I mean, we talked a bit at the beginning of this about skill sets and soft skills. Are there certain kinds of hard skills, technical skills that you see, as something that needs to be cultivated within your organization? I mean, you were talking about data visualization. Is it just Excel, or are we looking at other, other technologies that are out there?
I think there are a lot of technologies, but the skill that I see is critical thinking skills. Do you want it quick, fast, and in a hurry, or are you going to give me a time to put some analysis with it? That's a skill set sometimes we don't have. We're so used to, if it's hardware, let me buy you a bigger box. If it's software, let me get you the new version. But that critical thinking of what do you need, how are you going to use it, is a skill set that we need to cultivate within ourselves.
And I would add to that, from a very technical perspective, .NET developers are what we really need in the work that we're doing. And in local government, both at our counties and then at state government level, there is a very large population of developers who don't have that skill set. And they either have to make the choice to reinvent themselves, because when they went to school or when they learned the original COBOL and some other things, that if they don't reinvent themselves, they are going to be out of a job. And so there are some in that group that have been doing it for a while, the analytical ability. And so that's where you can, in some cases, move that individual into more of an analytical role. But it takes some time, and it does take some conversations. The last thing you want to do is ignore it. If you don't have .NET developers on staff or access to some sort of staff org, you really are not going to be able to use the new technologies to get you to the point where you can do the data visualization.
I have a list of COBOL programmers for you, by the way.
That's okay, we do too.
You mentioned some concerns about privacy and its impact. Can you talk a little bit about how your organizations are imbuing those policies, security policies, or just culture towards that? I mean, definitely the mindset, I think, of a younger generation of, share everything and the like, and this gets back to the balance between the CIO and the CDO. How does that fit into your thinking? Scary.
Well, you mentioned the younger generation, and I've said this to my children. I have a 24-year-old, 26 and 28, and they don't care. I'm like, until your identity is stolen, then maybe you'll wake up. And I'm very blunt with them, and they truly, they're on their mobile device, and it's like, oh, what's my bank account number? What's my password? They're sharing left and right. I'm like, no, don't do that. So the industry and the hacking situations and cybersecurity are helping us with that, because I do now I'm starting to see, that means I might not have any more money than the $10 I already have. Well, $10 is precious to them. So, they're starting to wake up, I believe. The technologies are affording us opportunities that we didn't have in the past to make this unified data set more secure. And if you're not using what's called ADFS, Active Directory Federated Services, you should be looking at that. It is, if you have your Microsoft products in place and have Exchange, you have the ability to tie into case management or other data systems by using the same user credentials. And it's really, that federation will federate with other credentials like your Facebook and some other external validated data sources. It's having been done in the industry probably 2 years or more, and we need to be doing that on the government side, because when your staff leave, if they have access to a data set that now is web-based, because before it wasn't so much an issue. Mm-hmm. Your systems were all internal and they had to have VPN in. Well, your Active Directory credentials get you into VPN, not a problem. Now you've got web-based applications that you can access anywhere in the world. And if that staff person leaves and that access to that case system is not deactivated, because here to tell you, the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand, so the staff person may be walking out the door, IT's taking away their privileges, but if you've got a standalone individual system being maintained, IT may not know, you guys need to take care of that. So there's ways to address security, which then I think helps the privacy piece of it, but you need to be aware and you need to be asking questions to your departments and to other standalone systems. How are they being validated? And then what's your process for ensuring that the access is either changed or taken away when that person leaves or moves? So a little in the weeds there, but something for you to think about.
I think that technology is in everything that we do. So now with social media, with the data visualization, that's my pet peeve today, y'all. Mobility, it's an opportunity to talk about privacy and risk. So I think that with technology, we now have more opportunities to get front and center. Before, security, privacy was thought of after someone gets in trouble. Now it's out there front and center, so take this opportunity to have dialogue each and every time you're in a road.
All right, moving back to that kind of proactive approach to it, again, the rise of this wrangler, engineer, business analyst, as someone who can champion that use of data, but not only of how it can be integrated, but also how it should be used. So we have, wrapping up, about 5 minutes more. So let me ask, any questions so far about what we've covered? We've been pretty good about raising hands, yes?
Rita and Carolyn, but you mentioned text messaging, a lot of casework now is using chat type software. How does that pose a dilemma when you're looking at unstructured to structured data sources and trying to use those in business analytics environment?
In 2 minutes, ooh. It's a lot, and it's a lot to think about. We know how efficient and how quick our users want responses, but the technology, the back end behind on how to secure it, the resources and the knowledge, I don't think we're ready yet.
And my short answer there is that policy really is critical as step one of what your end users are allowed to do and should be keeping and shouldn't be keeping. But then I would challenge you to take the next step, and that is, are you actively implementing the policy? We've talked about this in the office. No one wants to be the example, but if you don't have a policy that's enforceable, and use social media as the example, I do IT assessments for counties, and hey, yeah, we have the social media policy. Supervisors are responsible for making sure it's followed. And I talk to a supervisor in an interview, and they do whatever they want. Because of you've delegated that, and no one wants to make someone an example. So then what happens? So then you may end up in the newspaper because of what was put on social media, or there may be a lawsuit. So tough love, as I call it, it takes only one or two to show that the policy really is there to be followed. That's my short answer.
It's okay to say no every now and then.
So if there was one thing, the one immediate next step for someone who wanted to get moving on embracing data more and bring it into their culture, what would be this one moment, or that one thing that you'd tell them to focus on?
Communicate. Communicate with your users, your stakeholders, frequently, often. Make it a part of what you do each and every day.
Take the first step, where, albeit it may be small, you may have a help desk system. Do you share the analytics? How many tickets have been resolved in a month, and how many were open, how many were resolved, and what's my average length of time to close that ticket? And then share and communicate back to the departments. Start with something simple. If you're not haven't embraced this just yet, it's not a bad thing. It just gives you easy data, as I call it, easy data, meaningful data, because you may uncover some things you didn't know. So start simple, start small, and then communicate the results.
And what it means to them.
Yes.
They don't care that I closed 5 tickets this week, but they do care that I noticed a trend in a certain software that needed to be upgraded. They notice things like that, what it means to them. So communicate and make it real.
Any last questions from the audience? Well, thank you very much for your time today. It's great. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Rita.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.